Hello and welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to be taking kind of a deep dive into using feedback and using the feedback top and kind of explain how it works. And then you make this patch right now that allows you to create kind of a watery effect using displace and feedback in order to achieve that. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so in this tutorial, we're going to be focusing on feedback and kind of how that works. So if you opened up a new project and the default patch showed up, you can just hold down Shift, click and drag, and we're just going to delete all of that stuff for the time being. Now, to start out with, we're going to go through getting a few things set up, right? We want to be able to use the mouse to move something that's going to be producing feedback. And so to do that, we're going to need to use the mouse in. And I'm going to go through this first part pretty quick because I have other tutorials and there's a bunch out there that cover these things. But really quickly, we're going to double click. We're going to go to chop and we want to do mouse in, which, right, if you type MOU on the keyboard, you can gray out everything but what you need. So mouse in, right? And so now I should be able to, if this is playing, there we go. Also, mine was paused for whatever reason, but if it's playing, I should be able to see values changing, right? And so my values are going to be going from positive 99 to negative 99, although you can't see it in this window. I can probably expand this a bit. There we go. Right, so -1, right, +1, and this only goes up to about 0.6 and -0.6, right? And that's because this is set to normalized aspect. That's going to be fine. We're not super concerned about this. And there are other tutorials out there that'll show you how to accurately map the mouse to a particular, to a place in a window. We're just going to let it be offset a little bit for this tutorial just for speed and to make it's already going to be a lot of stuff to do. So we're going to fix that. Okay, so really we can just start by using this, and then we're going to go ahead and create a circle top. All right, so in our basic network, we're going to have the mouse in and the circle top. And so we want to be able to control where the center of this circle is based on this mouse in. So if I make this viewer active, I can grab this top value and click, drag, drop it on the 0 of the center for the circle parameter here. And that's going to be the center for the X value. I'm going to say chop reference, right? So now if I move my mouse back and forth, you can see that circle is moving back and forth as well. The next value I want to grab is my Y, and I'm just going to go ahead and drag that in to the Y value, chop reference. There we go, right? Now I can move this around and it more or less follows the mouse, at least in this little window. Now, one of the things we want to do is we're going to go ahead and set the aspect ratio here and now, so we don't have to deal with this later. So I'm going to have the circle selected, and under common, I'm going to change this from use input to custom resolution. And then for my resolution, I'm going to click on this arrow. I'm going to come down to 1280 by 720. This is the maximum size for the free version, which is why I've decided to choose that. And that's what we'll be using for all of this. Also, it should work on most hardware without lagging too hard. Okay. So the other thing we might want to do at this point is change our pixel format to 32-bit float. What this does is all of these things, it helps when we go through the rest of the chain to have 32-bit floats. It makes the noise, or the normal map we make is going to be better quality. It helps with just a lot of things to make it cleaner. Okay, so the other thing we need to change on the circle is our radius. Now, one of the things that would be nice to do, especially because eventually we're going to have 2 circles in here, is that it might be nice if we can adjust this radius somewhere outside of this operator, and then if we can pair those together. So I'm going to go ahead and come up here. I'm going to create a slider, which is, where is the slider at? There we go, slider. And then from that slider, if I double click really quickly, or if I click with the middle mouse, if I do the middle mouse button on this, I can go and create a null. And then I can lock my slider, right? And I can slide this back and forth, and you'll see that I get this value. Now, this value is going to make it 1 to 0, which isn't exactly what I want. I really want this circle size to be significantly smaller than it is. And if I select my circle again, you can see right now it's 0.4, right? So what I should probably do is if I hold down on my radius, you can see I can go and just drag to the side and make this a little bit smaller. So if I go to 0.1, that's a pretty good size. And I might want to go maybe a little bigger for my max size. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the middle mouse button and I'm going to go ahead and create a math operator. And you could also, right, just double click if that's not working, create a math operator and then connect the two nodes together with a wire. In this case, with math, all I want to do is I want to set the range. So I'm going to go to range, and the from range is right, the range coming in, which we know is 0 to 1, so that's right. But then the to range, I want this to be, we could just say 0, and let's just say 0.12, right? So we have this small range that's going in, coming out, and so that's the biggest, and it can go down to 0. We could set it to something non-zero if we wanted to, but that should work. So then what I can do is I can, click on the little star, come down here to my circle, find my radius, and instead of going into both of these fields, I can just hover over the word, and it will do it to both at the same time. So if I let go there, click chop reference, now both of those values will scale uniformly. And you can see down below in the window, my circle is getting a maximum size and a minimum size, right? Fantastic. Okay, so I've got my circle going. Let's go ahead and we're going to start by making our feedback loop. And what our feedback's going to allow us to do, and what feedback does, is basically it takes a frame, we tell it what frame to grab, and it's going to be grabbing the previous frame and then essentially blending it or overlaying it with the other frames. And really what it does is it kind of holds that previous frame in the operator. And then we have to do a couple things in order to make it blend and tell it how we want it to blend with the current frame. Right. And so what that can do is it allows us to have like tracers or kind of motion blur, things like that applied to this. So we're going to go ahead and start our loop. Now, the best thing to do is to kind of create like a beginning and an end for this. So I'm going to create a null. And then I'm going to rename this null. And if I just click here where the name is, I can just rename this start. Then I'm going to go ahead and middle mouse on this again, go to null, drag it pretty far over here. I'm going to call this end for the time being. Because the way feedback works, and it's something that using it, I failed miserably so many times that I felt like it was good to make a tutorial about this, because it's not necessarily obvious and it's a little finicky in terms of where you put things and how you get interesting results out of it. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to right click on our thing here, and we're going to insert an operator, and we're going to insert feedback. It's down at the very bottom of the first column. Right, so now we've got this feedback, but we don't want to just go to the end. And I want you to note what the feedback automatically does is it freezes a frame. And if I pulse this, right, it's going to basically reset the feedback loop and grab whatever that last frame was, right? So in this case, because every time I go up there, my circle is completely off screen, that's why this is blank now. So what we need is we need a way to blend this back in to, or essentially join whatever is currently happening here with whatever happened previously. And so the next step is we need to go ahead and tell feedback which operator we want to be targeting, right? And so we're going to go ahead and target the end. So what we need to do is we select our feedback. You'll note there are very few options here. And so I'm going to go ahead and drag this end operator into there. And so now you'll see I've got that connection back. Still, right, nothing's happening. If I pulse this, it's still going to be the same, right? I'm not going to be able to see anything. So what we need to do is we need a way to blend this with the raw signal that we're getting in. And so what we're going to do is we're going to right click. And in this case, we're going to insert a comp, right, a composite operator. And this composite operator, right, it already has feedback going in there. We're going to go ahead and drag our raw footage in there as well. And you can see, again, still not getting a whole lot of anything happening at this point. Let's go ahead and hit add and see if we get something else. So now that we're using add, you can see that we're essentially painting, right? We've created something that paints. Now this gets totally filled up. And that's part of why feedback has this reset button. So if I pulse this, it's going to reset it, and then I can essentially draw again. Right. And so this is kind of great, except that it is, right, just kind of overriding everything, and it's going to fill in completely. So what we need to do is we need to add a little bit more in here in order to essentially get our feedback to fade over time. And so in order to do that, we're going to go ahead and insert an operator between the feedback and the comp. And that operator is going to be a level. And if I put the level in here, what I need to do is I need to go to the post tab here in my parameters, and I need to reduce the opacity. And I want you to see what happens as soon as I do that, right? You saw this change. And now as did I go? Okay, here it goes. It's going slow. I'm going to go ahead and make this the background so you can kind of see it a bit better, right? But you can see that very, very slowly, right, that chain of circles that have been drawn to the screen are evaporating. And so the lower I set the opacity on this level, the faster that operation happens. So if I dial this down to like 0.957, right, now I'm starting to get something that's a bit more like a tracer, right? And our goal here is to create an effect where it looks like we're essentially like running a finger through water, right? And so we might want to dial this down just a little bit lower. If we go too low, it's going to go really fast. A lot of tutorials, you can see that this is essentially just like motion blur, right? That's a little bit too fast for what we need. So I'm going to go back up to, if I go, let's see here. We might want it to be even a little bit slower than that. Let's go ahead and go up to like 92 or something like that. That should probably be fine. Yeah, this will be more useful as we do this tutorial. But so this is what feedback is, right? It's essentially every frame, if this is happening 60 frames a second, right? The circle's being drawn to the screen. And feedback is essentially grabbing the previous frame and then we're essentially gluing these things together using the composite, right? If I was to go to my composite and change the operation from add to average or something like that, right? I'm going to get a very different result. It's actually going to make this kind of more like a merge. You can test all these different options. Each one's going to act a little differently, right? Some of them are not going to work at all. And you can see, and it's just sort of a test, right? Some work, some don't. Some it would depend on what's happening, if there's other things in the scene. It looks like screen actually. Maybe we'll use screen. Screen is really nice and smooth. So yeah, let's go ahead and use screen instead of add. Either one of these is going to work. They're similar operations in terms of the math that they're doing. Okay, so this is the basics of how feedback works. And there's a lot of different things that we can do with it. And so what we're going to do is we want to take this feedback and we want to be able to use it to manipulate an image or a video. And in this case of this tutorial, but I just wanted to show like one of the ways that you can take, something that's reasonably simple like this and then build on that into something, potentially more interesting. Okay, so there is one component that we're going to need for this network that is not included by default as one of the components in the palette, right? Under image filters, there's a bunch of options, and under tools, there's some options as well. But the one that we're looking for specifically is available on TouchDesigner site for free. And it is this normal map v2, right? The link, you can pause and take a look at the link. If you just go to derivative.ca and search for normal map, or do it in Google, normal map v2. This link comes up pretty quickly. Just as a heads up, this is by Paqueta 12. He's sort of a mad genius of TouchDesigner. I highly suggest looking at his tutorials on YouTube if you haven't already. They're amazing. And he offered this up for free. So go ahead and download this. And then to get this into your patch or your network is pretty simple. You can go ahead and, at least on the Mac, I can come over here and I've put it in my palette, but I haven't refreshed, so it isn't updated yet, but you'll see I have this normal mat tops.tox. I'm going to go ahead and drag this in here and just drop it in, and I'll hit OK. And now I've got this network. You can see by default, or this tox, you can see component, you can see by default, it has some noise in there. If I zoom in on it, right, I can pop in and you can kind of see what's happening. It's not a super complex set of operations, but it saves us a whole bunch of time and it's fantastic. So I'm going to pop back out of there. And what we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and drop this end directly in there. And I want you to see what's happening. Now, if you're not familiar with normals and normal maps and what those are, basically anytime you're working with 3D textures, like if you've done any 3D modeling or animating or anything like that, one of the channels for your material or your texture is usually a normal channel. And what normals do is they use red, green, and blue as a way to kind of tell the computer what direction this surface should be facing, right? And so this allows you to use a texture to then apply like a facsimile of depth to the surface of an object. Now, if you're looking at an object on the tangent, you can see the edge. You won't see, like, it doesn't actually move the geometry. So you won't see the geometry raise or lower based on the normals. However, you can, using displacement in 3D software, you can get a normal map to adjust the underlying geometry. But oftentimes it's just used to add like texture and things to something where it's a really like much faster way to work. And so using this, we can then go forward and we can start displacing some images. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is go ahead and create a movie file in, which is down here. And we could use the default banana. If you hit the plus sign next to file, one that I found that actually works pretty well is wherever the flower is, the trillium. There we go. We're going to go ahead and open that. And that's just because it has pixels all the way across the entire frame. And then we are going to go ahead and we're going to need a displace as well. So I've grabbed my displace. In the top input, I want the movie file. And the normal map is going to go into that bottom input. Now, when this starts, and let me go ahead and change the operator that is currently displayed. If we go ahead and pull this up, right, you're going to see I'm getting some really weird results here, right? This is not working out quite well. It's really pixelated. There's a lot of stuff going on here. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my feedback, go to common, and I want to just start switching to, at least at this point, we're just going to be using RGBA for all of these. We're eventually going to go to RG, and we'll talk about that in a second. But we are going to start by just making some of these RGBA. You can kind of see that I'm still getting some problems. If I go to Displace and set this to RGBA, it might get a little bit better. You'll notice here, I don't have the option, right? Because this is a container and it should be set up the way that I want it to be set up anyway. My null here, also I can't set it. So I'm going to go to comp and I'm going to make sure I have it set here as well, just to make sure that at least that chain is clean. It's still a little bit ugly. And there's some other issues here, like this movie file doesn't do anything. So the other thing I want to do is I want to go to the comment on my movie file in. I want to change this to 32 RGB. Fantastic. Okay. So I've got all of those things set, and you'll see that I'm getting really strange results here. So I'm going to select my displace, and I'm going to go to the displace tab, And the biggest thing here is the displace weight, right? For what we're doing, we want our displace weight to be really small. So even if I go down to 0.1, you're going to see that automatically this thing is slowly making its way up. But when I go over this, actually at this point, you can't really tell how warped it is. We're going to find that out here in a second when we add a little bit more variety to this. Okay, so we're at least getting something happening here in our window. But in the end, this is pretty boring and it looks absolutely nothing like rippling water. So we need to do a bit more to what we're doing with our feedback, right? Currently, all we're doing is making it less opaque, right? Essentially, we're creating that trail, but that's all we've done. And we need to add a few more changes to this between our feedback and where it connects to this comp. And we need to keep the level in here. I'm going to go ahead and make one change to this network real quick. I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to go ahead and open up a new pane, and I want to split left-right. In this pane, I am going to make sure I select that. I'm going to hit P to hide the parameters. I'm going to come over here, and at least for the time being, I'm going to keep this up. You'll notice it pops up in both windows, but I don't want it in the background here. So I'm going to right click. I'm going to go down to display, and I'm going to uncheck background tops so it is hidden. That makes the network a lot easier to see. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. Oh, I'm going to make this a little bit smaller here, just so I have a bit more space here. And then this network, I can shrink down and scroll out of the way so we can kind of see that video or that footage fine. Okay, so let's go back to here so you guys can see all the connections and everything well. And what we need to do is we need to insert another thing here. Now, one of the tools that's really useful that in feedback is the edge operator. So if I go to insert operator and I go to edge, which is down here again in the bottom of this first column, and drop this in here, you're going to see that I start to get some crazy results over here. It looks kind of cool, not exactly what I would want to have happen, but we're getting some really interesting things happening, right? And what this is doing is it is finding the edges. And when you combine find edges with feedback, you get edges that find the edges, that find the edges, that find the edges, that find the edges, and then eventually you get this crazy pattern running over and over again. Now, one of the things we can do with our edge is we can turn comp over input on, and that's going to make a little bit of a change. You can notice that instead of this, if I turn this off, it just changes things a little bit. In terms of how this is set up. And there's some other things that we need to set, some other changes we need to make to this network. So first, we need to come in here and we have our black level and our strength. Right now, we're going to leave the black level at 0. The strength is the problem, right? It's a little bit too high. And by a little bit, I mean a lot. If I dial this strength down to about 0.2, and then let's go ahead and find our feedback, and maybe we can reset our feedback. You can see that this is, right, still causing a little bit more problems than I would want. Okay, so even resetting our feedback, you can see we get this thing, but then it just continues to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. So there's a couple other things we need in here. And this is all like, part of this is I'm adding these things in because I've done this before, but there was a lot of testing and playing and trying to figure out which operators worked best together. And honestly, playing is part of the fun of TouchDesigner, right? So what I know that I need next is after my edge and before my level, I need to blur this. And I want you to see what happens just with the default settings for blur. I'm going to go ahead and hit insert operator. Blur is up here near the top of this. And if I click on that, suddenly I get you may have used the feedback edge previously in a demo or whatever, and it kind of basically does this and spits some other things out. but it's nice to know how you get you get to that. So, right, we've got this set. We can increase or decrease our filter size. So if I increase this to 8, 9, 10, or 11 or 12, I want you to note that at 7, right, it's still not blurry enough because it just continuously kind of feeds back on itself. Now, this can be really cool for a lot of reasons, and it may be something that interests you and that works really well for your application. But if we want this to be something where, say, we disturb the water and then we stop disturbing the water, we're going to need to do a couple more changes to this. So first, one of the things I found is just increasing this size to about 12, right? You'll see that we get motion across the surface, but it's not so overwhelming that it starts to feed back on itself in an endless loop. It kind of slows the feedback down a little bit, right? So it feeds back for a while, and then eventually those essentially echoes resolve, right? Whereas, if the filter size on this blur is lower, then the echoes just continue continuously, which may be what you're looking for. In our case, that's not necessarily what we're looking for. Now, the other thing I want you to note is that wherever this circle is, right, it doesn't look like the back of the image, right? It's actually kind of changing things because it's pure white and everything else is essentially black. And so it's adjusting the displacement pretty harshly, right? It's essentially acting like a magnifying lens on the image behind it, which could be interesting, but that's not exactly right what we're going for with this. We'd like it for that circle to disappear when we're done making this surface move. This is a great time to save our work, as TouchDesigner does occasionally crash unexpectedly. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in here, but we'll put it in there. And I'm going to call this Wetness because why not? Okay. So if you remember, I said that normal maps, right, use RGB values to kind of show direction. And you can see how even when this is sitting still, we've got this essentially like gradient lump on here that's red, green, and there's some like blue and purple and some yellows in there, right? And this is kind of showing the ramp of colors that we've got. So let's go ahead and we're going to make a couple changes here. First, let's take our circle, and what we need to do is we want this circle to disappear, right? And in this case, what that means is it doesn't need to go transparent, but it needs to turn black, right? And if I was to just go ahead and set this fill color to black right now, right? Everything's gone. It disappears completely. And so what I would like is that when I stop moving the mouse, it figures out that it should be turning black, right? So let's go ahead and put this back to white before we forget. So we want to be able to turn this black. Now, one of the things that we could potentially do, because we know that we want like RGB values, and maybe we can see what this does, but if we set this value to 0, set this value to 0, right, I'm going to get a red circle. Now, I want you to note that it warps this in a very different way. Like if you look at the center of that circle, right, things are different than they were before. Let's look at what that normal map looks like. And you can kind of see what it's doing. It's creating this cup. It's actually creating like a magnifying lens on the surface of the water, which is pretty cool. I don't know. It's interesting anyway. But so we're going to go ahead and just leave it with that one color. And what we're going to do is we're eventually going to add another, like a green circle on here as well. And that's why we're going to be using the RG, because we're just going to work with red and green for at least these initial start things. But let's start with just our red circle. And this way we're just going to go ahead and change this one color value. And so if I want something to know when I've stopped, right, what I need to do is I need to be tracking the amount of change over time, right? So right now I know exactly where I am at any point in time when I'm moving my mouse. This is not, but it's not telling me, am I moving? It's just telling me you are here, right? Every single frame, it's like you are here, you are here, you are there, you are everywhere, right? But what it needs to do is it needs to be connected, or it needs to be determining how quickly I'm going from here to here. And if that quickness is 0, like I'm not moving at all, then we can use that value to set the color of our circle. So to do that, we're going to start by opening this up a little bit. We're going to right click on here, or middle click, sorry. And the one that we need is we need something called slope. And slope is a mathematical term, right, that basically is saying how quickly is something moving, right? And so you can see the slower I move, the slower my slope is. The faster I move, the bigger my slope is, right? And so if I stop, my slope is 0, right? So that means that I now have the ability to let TouchDesigner know when my mouse has stopped moving, and then I can adjust the color of the circle. So I need a couple more things to make this work. One, I don't want to, you'll note that depending on which direction I move, if I move from the middle to the right of the screen, it's going to be positive. If I go the other way, it's going to be negative. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that that's always positive. So I'm going to go ahead and middle mouse and then grab a math. And with this math, I am going to do one change, which is this channel pre-operation, which is positive. And what that does is it basically says, it does like an absolute value, if you're familiar with that term. It basically says no matter what this is, negative or positive, we're outputting a positive value. Great. So I've got some positive values here. Now, the other thing is, if I use this the way I currently have it set, it's going to be really jittery, and it's not going to be very smooth at all in its transition. But we could go ahead and try that, but I'd rather just jump in and drop in the next operator we need, which is a trigger. And what a trigger does is it basically, you can see it's working really effectively, but you can see how it's smoothing that change, right? So anytime I move, it's triggering when that motion happens, but then it takes a while for it to go back to 0. And I want you to see that for a moment, it pauses about halfway down. If I zoom completely the wrong way, you won't be able to see what I'm doing. If I zoom in, you can see, right? It drops down. And so what's happening here is, first, there's the trigger threshold. And so this trigger threshold is set to 0. So as soon as the value is not 0, it's going to trigger this thing. If I increase this up some, then you'll see that right now only the X is triggering because I didn't move in the Y direction enough, right? But if I just move up and down, only the Y is triggering. And for us, that doesn't really matter. We might want to, I'm going to leave it at 0 for now. We might want to, if it's too twitchy, we might want to come in here and increase that threshold. So if we wiggle just a tiny bit, nothing happens. But if we actually move, then it triggers and the color changes. And so what I want to do now is go to the attack. And this is where these changes take place. So there's the delay length, there's the attack length. This is basically from the time the trigger is set until it reaches its maximum value, which is 1, or I think, yep. How much time should elapse? And right now it's 0.2 seconds. The peak level here is how loud should it get, or how big should it get? It's 1. And then the peak length is how long should it stay at that value, which is 0.1 second. If I go down to sustain, the decay length is 0.2, which means it should take 0.2 of a second to decay. But then the decay goes down to this sustain level, which is 0.5, and then it's going to drop down to 0, right? And that's the release, is how long does it take to go from here to 0, right? And that's 0.3 seconds. And so those are the default settings for this. We could go ahead and use this and just see what we get. Now, there's one other thing I'm going to do, because we don't need both of these triggers, right? We only need to know if we're moving at all. We don't care what direction we're moving, if it's up and down or left and right. We just want to choose one. And so what we can do is we can take this value, put it in a math operator. And the math operator has this combine channels option. And so there's a bunch of different ways you can combine channels. You can add them together, you can multiply them, divide them, whatever. What we're going to do is we're just going to say maximum. We just want to know whichever one it has the biggest amount of change, that's the one we want to reference. It doesn't really, there's other operations in there we could use, but this one will be effective for what we want to do in this case. So I'm just compressing this down to make it a little easier to work with because our circle's all the way back here. And so we might need to adjust our network a little bit. I'm just going to scoot some operators over, do some house cleaning real quick, just to make this all fit on one screen. Ideally, I'd have it laid out a little bit differently, but for now it's going to work. Okay, so in my circle, what I want to do is I want to adjust the fill color, and this is the color that I'd like to adjust. So I'm going to go ahead and make this viewer active. I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to drop it just here and hit Export Chop Reference. And now you can see if I stop moving, my circle becomes black, the ripples stop. But as soon as I move, the ripples trigger. Now you'll see that last little pop is kind of a bit delayed, right? We don't necessarily want that to happen quite so slowly. So let's go ahead and come in here, and we could either get rid of our decay length. We can try a couple different things. So we move it. You can kind of see how it holds and then pops. I think this would work better if we had no decay length and maybe set our sustain level to 0. Right? So now as soon as it's done, it just disappears. Now, again, this is something where you could adjust these values for another use or because it's interesting to you. But in this case, right, it just pops and then disappears. Right? And so now we've got the ability to create this like rippled effect across the water. I would say the circle might be a little bigger than we'd want it to be. So I'm going to go back to my slider. I'm going to dial this down just a touch. And then I'm going to hold still so it disappears. And now, right, I can make these ripples across this image. Okay, so through experimentation, I found that the best values for the trigger in this use case are the following. Set your trigger threshold to just barely above 0, 0.02. If you go to the attack tab, set the delay length to 0, set the attack length to 0.09. Everything else should remain the same. And then in the sustain tab, you want to set your decay length to 0.02, sustain level to 0.5, release length to 0.06. Right? And so basically what this is going to do is when we add our next element, it makes it so it smoothly operates and we get a good result where it's tracking the motion, it doesn't drop any motion that we're doing, and it kind of creates a little plop or pop at the end there for that final ripple. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of lag in here, which is just going to kind of smooth things out a little bit more. If we right-click between our mouse in and our slope and click Insert Operator and go to lag, which is in the third column, right kind of in the middle. And we can just leave these, let me double check. Yeah, we can just leave all of the default settings here. You can make adjustments if you want to. Right now, there's no overshoot, right? So it's just sort of slowing down the process. And what this does is it basically like helps with some easing. So it doesn't like move right away. It feels a bit more natural usually. Okay, so we've got our ripple. Now, one of the things that we can do if we wanted to, is we could actually create a second circle and have them overlay and have them be different colors. And then we could get some more interesting results from the ripples on the surface. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So we're going to go ahead and take our circle and move it out of the way and go ahead and we're going to copy this and paste it. And you can see that that's already basically overlaying the same thing. However, what we want to do is if we select this one, currently our fill color is set to the red value. We want to put this in the green. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Command or Control X to delete that. I'm going to set this to 0. Now I'm going to go to green and I'm going to go ahead and paste that value in there. So now this one's going green, the other one's going red. And right now they're immediately on top of each other and their position is identical. So we're not really getting any benefit from that. However, we can use this lag to change the position of this so it's offset from the other circle a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and for my lag, I'm going to make the viewer active. I'm going to come up here and where the center values are, right? I could either drag these over. I could also just click here and highlight the mouse in part and just type in lag 1 and then go down to the next line and type in lag 1 again, or just type in lag, right? Because it is lag 1. We're just typing the name here. And because these values have the same name, this should work just fine. And so now you'll see that I get this, like, I should be getting a slightly offset thing. Oh, I've forgotten a major important part here. We need to actually draw both of these to our screen, right? We're still just drawing the red one. So if I right click here and go to Insert Operator, and I'm going to go ahead and say Composite, and then I'm going to connect this in as well. So now you can see nothing is happening, right? And if I zoom in on this, you'll see what's going on is that I have this black circle that as these things are, if they're perfectly overlapped, it's black. But if they're offset, then it's white. What we want to do is we want to change this to add, right? And so now if they move, they go to black. And if they're moving around the screen, you can kind of see these two circles following each other, right? So this can add a couple more ripples. It can just add a little bit more complexity. Right now, my lag is offset enough, right, that it's a pretty big lag. I could tighten that up some if I wanted to, but for our use, it's just making more ripples on the surface, which kind of looks cool, and I'm okay with that, right? It's kind of giving us that leading edge and then a secondary edge that's on there as well. And I want you to note that, right, it really does now kind of give us a much more magnified look in the frame when we do that. And there's things we could do to make it even more interesting, but we're going to keep it relatively simple at this point. This is already a long tutorial. Okay, so that's pretty cool and all. One other possible setting I want to show you is that it would be great, one, if this water wasn't perfectly still all the time. And two, maybe we would want to also be able to have raindrops fall on this surface. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop this video here, and then we will pick up with raindrops and ripples on the second section.